A very warm welcome to all our listeners on NRI Samay. This is your host Suresh from New Jersey. Today we have on our show Nikhil Dey, prominent social activist and also founder of Mazdoor Kisan Shakti Sangathan, an organization that has been instrumental behind many acts and various other legislations, including the RTI Act in 2005. So Nikhil is going to talk about the various policies and implementations of acts that are meant for the social welfare, social security of the poorest of the poor and the most marginalized people of the country, especially the rural India. So Nikhil, thank you very much for joining our show today.
Thanks so much, Suresh. It's a pleasure to be on.
Thank you, Nikhil. Nikhil, I know we'll focus this interview on the social security aspects of the people, in terms of the various acts that have been implemented and how their implementation is helping the people on the ground, or what are the various issues or deficiencies that you may have seen over the several years. But before we get into that, I would like to just ask a very fundamental question. When did the thought of having something like a social security for people below the poverty line actually started? When was this idea sort of conceived?
So the idea of social security is part of the welfare state. And in that sense, it's not something that's new to either movements or us or India. It's an idea that the state is there to make sure that where you have a society where inequality is written into the society, the state plays a proactive role to create a situation where those who are either economically or otherwise marginalized will be able to make their way into being a useful part of society, as well as be able to run their lives and their families in a reasonable fashion. Now, one side of it is things like education and health, which people need all their lives. And another part of it is what happens when they're in distress. So that may be old age, it may be in situations of poor health, it may be in situations of disaster. So that's a kind of framework where individuals cannot cope, and particularly those who are poorer cannot cope. The state has a role to play. But there are the kinds of legislations that actually the movements in India fought for and saw some kind of fruition and saw those legislations coming about from the year 2005 onwards. Are legislations that are not strictly in the realm of social security. So, for instance, the NREGA is seen by one set of people as welfare, but by many others as the right to work. So I remember, for instance, when we first started working in the MKSS, in the Devdungri area in the late 80s, 87, 88, and there was a terrible drought, and a planning commission team came there. Hundreds and thousands of people gathered, and they said, we don't want to beg, we don't want a handout, we want work. हमें काम चाहिए. So it is actually the desire to work permeates right through society. And that same articulation of 1987 of हमें काम चाहिए, we will work, and for work we want a reward, and that work will contribute towards the development of society. That the first slogan of the movement for the right to work was हर हाथ को काम दो, काम का पूरा दाम दो. So every hand wants work, every work wants a just reward. And I think that applies across the board to all of us. So, and if you look at the RTI, which was the right to access government records, it's actually demanding a share of democratic governance. So there's nothing in that sense social security about it. It's actually a proactive citizenry saying, give us access to records so that we can also monitor, so that we can make sure the country can run, and so that we can play a part in it. So the right to education, countries around the world understand that unless all children have a right to equal and free access to education, your society can never advance. So it's a framework that doesn't strictly lie in the realm of social security, but of course it does. So old age pensions in a country like India, where you have 93% of the workforce in the unorganized sector, there is no pension for them in their old age. So they may have survived barely while they worked very hard and contributed to the country. And then somehow the country doesn't think there's a responsibility. They call them senior citizens, but don't think there's a responsibility. So the right to pensions in your old age is something that is actually in the realm of social security, but it's also something that needs to be legislated. India has a pathetic 200 rupees. The central government gives 200 rupees a month as social security pension to the elderly, to the disabled, to widows. And so some states top it up, but can you imagine living on 7 rupees a day?
Yeah, it is quite pathetic. Speaking of which, it's a nice segue into our next section. You briefly touched upon the Rural Employment Guarantee Act, which, for the benefit of our listeners, just a one-line definition of what this act is supposed to do is to provide at least 100 days of guaranteed work in every household. And this act came into being in 2005 and was implemented throughout all the districts, I believe, by 2008-2009. Nikhil, I believe you are also a member of the state guarantee council, State Employment Guarantee Council of Rajasthan. Are you still a member?
Not still a member, no.
Okay.
I was a member, and I was a member of the Central Council as well twice, but I'm not today.
So you have observed very closely, and you yourself have been involved in this right from day one. So the 100 days of work that needs to be guaranteed, what kind of work comes under this act, and what qualifies? Like, who are these people who qualify for the 100 days of the guaranteed work?
So there's 2-3 unique features of this act. Of course, as you read out that one line, it was an incredible commitment in some ways that India made, because it was at a time when across the world, in the neoliberal framework, it was being said that markets will deal with everything. They are a grand solution to everything. And markets were not and are not, in fact. Markets are there and are necessary, but they cannot solve all issues. And certainly employment, they were not able to, and there was huge underemployment and unemployment. So the guarantee of 100 days work, number one, did not guarantee work around the year. Number two, it was at minimum wages. And number three, and what was very unique about this, was it said anyone willing to come and do manual work for 8 hours a day could get work. So it managed to, in terms of implementation, get us out of this whole business of targeting and selection. It was a self-targeting program, because nobody who is affluent would obviously want to come and spend 8 hours in the sun digging or doing construction work or manual work. And therefore, it's only those people who really needed that kind of employment who would come forward. So you didn't have a bureaucracy having to select, okay, you're the poor, you're not. And this famous, what happens in India, these completely flawed BPL lists, that these are the below poverty line people, but actually they're affluent, and the real poor get left out. That did not happen and does not happen under this kind of formulation. So it was a very, very, very useful way of being able to select who could come for work. So, and it was just 100 days, so it meant that at other times you find other work, or when there's work in the field, so it wouldn't affect the normal employment cycle. In fact, it would help it. And in vast parts of the country, the injection of those funds actually led to greater economic activity in that area, because wages came to poor households, those wages went into the market. When they went into the market, there was greater economic activity in very depressed areas. So even during the economic downturn affecting the rest of the world, many, many economists acknowledge that the NREGA played a very big role in keeping those parts of rural India not just free from the effect of that, but actually those who lost their jobs in cities and came back had something to turn to. And that's a very important role. Now, what the assets are, actually, I'd like to start. Generally, there is this whole allegation made against NREGA that it's just digging ditches and filling them up, which is far, far from the truth. And I have often said that those who are making that allegation need to show even one proper study in all these years that shows that is what the nature of the work was. So simply asserting over and over again that this is useless work is completely wrong. We don't have a problem when infrastructure is built in our urban centers. But somehow we are unable to understand that there are many hamlets, particularly those of Dalits and of marginalized communities, who don't even have a dirt road where a motorcycle can reach them or a footpath can reach them. So yes, it is labor-intensive work, but labor-intensive work can get you the beginnings of a road. It can get you a check dam for water conservation. It can get you forestry around. It can get your charaga or your pasture land developed. It can get your fallow fields converted into something very productive by doing a whole lot of land development work. All that is labor intensive and work with mud and earth. Actually, after all, farming is work with earth.
Right.
So it's really an urban elitist failure to understand the nature of that work. And if one were to look at climate change today, and if one were to look at the concept of carbon credits, I think the world's biggest program that would get carbon credits, because there's no use of machines, labor displacing machines, and it's work that restores water, forests, green cover, using the least disruptive methods, if properly implemented, would be the NREGA. I mean, it has done an intensive amount of good in many ways. It's also actually brought women into the workforce. That's something I forgot to mention. Women have always been there working, but their work has never been acknowledged and they've never been paid. So large numbers, much larger than 50% in many states are women. And for the first time, they had bank accounts. Money went straight into their bank accounts. So they entered the market and they entered the economy they should have been paid more. NREGA is currently undergoing several crises, which I'll talk about, one of which is wages. But they entered the market for the first time with money in their bank accounts, where they were able to buy stuff for their kids and make sure education happened and the family. We know many families that actually were able to survive because the woman had worked 100 days and she had that much money. You can't survive just on 100 days work, but she had that much money which could keep a health crisis or an education crisis or another crisis away. So there are a range of assets, and today actually in what they call convergence, NREGA joins many other programs. So the whole program for building rural housing, which is a massive program of this current government, is enhanced because the labor component comes from NREGA. Or in Swachh Bharat, the toilets, the labor component comes from NREGA. In many, many states, they are building cattle sheds and they are building various things to enhance the rural economy, where again the labor component and part of the material component also comes from NREGA. So it's a program that, if you were to really count all the assets and do a proper evaluation, you would find that there is no bigger program for rural infrastructure than the NREGA.
Right. So before we jump into the issues, as you mentioned earlier, I'd like to just ask two very quick questions. So in terms of the funding itself, I mean, who funds the work under the NREGA? Is it the state or the center or combine both? And at the ground level, who is the implementing authority? I mean, who provides the oversight of these works?
Yeah. So the NREGA is a combination of funding, but the bulk of the funding, it's a national law. And obviously, the Parliament could not have forced a state government to provide the bulk of resources, could not have passed a law which it would have required state governments to do it. So 100% of the labor component, and NREGA is mainly a labor program, comes from the central government. And it is the only program, because it's backed by law, that is not constrained by a budget. So it is the duty of Parliament and the government to provide as much money as long as people are demanding up to 100 days work. And it is demand driven. Nobody can be refused work if they have a job card and they have not completed 100 days. And therefore that, in theory, it is again quite a breakthrough, where the central government is supposed to fund 100% of the labor component and 75% of the material component. So out of material, 25% the state government is to contribute to. And since the implementing agency is the state government, it can do as much or as little material intensive works that it feels necessary, as long as it maintains a ratio of 60-40. 60% of the expenditure on labor and 40% on material, not in every work, but in a particular area. So that the labor-intensive nature of it is not lost. Now, while the state governments are the implementing agencies, what has been a very big problem is lack of funding. So even though the law requires funds to come, it has been seen that successive governments, first the UPA II, UPA I was much more supportive of this, but UPA II started constraining fund releases. And what that has is, even though the rhetoric is that, oh, if you give more work, we will give more money, but if you start delaying the release of those funds, people lose interest in the program, because these are very vulnerable people who live from day to day. And if their wages are going to be delayed by weeks, months, even up to a year sometimes, there is no way that they would see this as something that they could viably go to and have their home survive. So that delay in wages has been a very, very serious issue. And that delay is driven a lot by the lack of resources that the center gives on time. So the last 2 years, for instance, there have been, at the end of the year, about 10 to 12,000 crores. In the previous year, there was 15,000 crores in pending liabilities, which means wages unpaid at the end of the year. And yes, you will pay it when the next year's budget comes, but that for a worker, wages delayed is almost like wages denied. So, because for them, for a vulnerable worker, that is their existence. So, the NREGA actually, Suresh, suffers from it is the victim of a class who don't understand the kind of how much of a lifeline it is for poor people. And in many cases, the impact the NREGA has had on stabilizing rural wages, increasing them to some non-exploitative level, giving people dignity and the ability to fight for justice and against exploitation. All that has caused a reaction amongst the feudal and even in the contractor class, which is very much the face of the capitalist economy on the ground. And both of them have felt that labor is being given too much, and this is not allowing them to get workers. Actually, they've got workers, but they have to pay them more. And NREGA functions in that sense like a kind of market mechanism, because if you pay less than NREGA work wages, people say, why should we come to you? So, but that has caused a big reaction, and it's caused even the implementing agency to start undermining the program. And so when one says that, NREGA workers are lazy or they don't work, what one needs to understand is that those who are implementing the program are actually designing it, that work management on the site, in a fashion where they're encouraging people not to work. Because when they encourage particularly the more influential people not to work, they don't have to work themselves. The engineers don't have to work, nobody else. They just write that people have done less work, they pay them less wages, and the really poor have no voice to be able to get work done. And so many, many, many of the failures, including some degree of corruption, not implementing social audits, not taking action on people's complaints on corruption, all come down to those who draw a salary and don't perform. They are the ones who are actually making what is a program that has a lot of potential to be implemented, not perfectly because it's a huge program, but very well. They have undermined its basic ethos.
You briefly touched on the delay of the wages as being the biggest problem NREGA is currently suffering. These delays, 10,000 to 12,000 crores over the past 1 or 2 years, these are huge delays. Not paying for 2 years for the people who are surviving on 200 rupees a day or 150 rupees a day, depending on what kind of work and who is actually working. Does the law provide anything to sort of, appeal in the court in these kind of circumstances?
So there's currently a very important case in the Supreme Court which has been going on for almost 2 years, or more than 2 years, called Swaraj Abhiyan versus Union of India and others. So all the states are also parties. That case dealt with what was happening in a drought, and in a drought condition, NREGA is almost one of the only mechanisms you have to be able to deal with drought conditions and give people not just relief but some kind of ability to survive with dignity. The Supreme Court has, in very minute detail, traced where the delays are, why they are there, proved that they are there. NREGA has an extraordinary website where actually, because it followed the RTI, all the information is in the public domain. Who got wages, how much they got, when they didn't get, how long they haven't been paid. And the Supreme Court has come down very heavily on the government of India already in one judgment in May last year, saying that not paying wages on time is a violation of fundamental rights and is almost like forced labor. And they have reserved judgment on another where hopefully they will make it clear that when there are delays in wages, NREGA itself has a mechanism where you're supposed to automatically pay compensation. But the government of India is being so perverse that it has put in mechanisms where it says that only the delay which the state government has caused will be counted. The delay that's there because of lack of funds will not be counted. It will not even be calculated. And that's the bulk of the delay. And these are all not through the Act, but through guidelines and rules, so which go contrary to the Act. And then what they call an annual master circular. And there's another provision which allows a BDO to say, okay, this compensation can be paid or does not need to be paid. So in fact, for the last 7 years since this automatic compensation came into effect, automatic should have been without any question going into the bank account because it's only 0.05% per day, which means 18% a year. It's only interest, it's not even compensation. Over 90% of those compensation, automatically calculated compensation amounts have been denied because BDOs have said, no, don't pay. And it's just power given in their hands. So these are the various mechanisms used by the state machinery and the governments to undermine a law passed by Parliament, to undermine a law celebrated across the world, to undermine a law that actually gives less than 1% of the GDP to make sure rural employment can run. And funds, therefore, are a big issue. Currently, another big issue being fought for is that the government of India is now not paying minimum wages on NREGA. It's notifying NREGA wages less than the state minimum wage in more than 20 states.
Wow.
And the Supreme Court has repeatedly said paying anyone less than the minimum wage is forced labor, is a violation of Article 23. And yet they brazenly continue to do that. And that's why these are things that all of us must understand, that when it comes to the very poor, unless we really stand with them, there is so much power in the more affluent that they can do all kinds of things. After all, NREGA demands work output, so it's not a dole.
Right.
It's not. It's something people are working and then being paid. So we need to understand it's very different from food stamps or various other measures. Here you're asking people to work for 8 hours. You're measuring their output. You're paying as per measurement. So they're not to even make provisions that for a full day's work people will get the minimum wage. That's as perverse as it can get. And yet the government has ignored everything. All its own committee said that it must pay. It set up another committee to make sure it won't pay. So unlike some of the other laws like RTI, where the middle class has come behind the RTI to support it, as a result, the RTI, even though the government wants to undermine that law you find much stronger capacities to be able to keep fighting government attempts to undermine it. Whereas in the NREGA, because it concerns only the poor, I think we all have a responsibility, those who are more privileged, to really understand its issues and try and stand with people.
Right. And what are the current minimum wages prevailing in the in the country? I mean, and how recent has this been?
So when NREGA began, the provision was that you had to pay the prevailing state minimum wage for agricultural labor. And therefore, till 2011, everyone was paid the state minimum wage. And it did not make the economy collapse. Nothing happened of that kind. But in 2011, the government changed and said it will notify a minimum. It will notify an NREGA wage, whether or not it is the minimum wage of the state. And therefore, at that time, when it began, 4 states, there was Kerala, Mizoram, Haryana, and a 4th state, that did not actually, the NREGA wage was lower than the state minimum wage. But today there are more than 20 states. And today, this last year, so NREGA has a provision of indexing the wage to inflation. So, which every state has, their minimum wage is also indexed. So, last year, on the 1st of April, the government announced this year that in 10 states there was actually deflation as per their calculation, and therefore they have not increased the wage at all, including the state of Rajasthan. So while minimum wages go up because they are also indexed to inflation, some calculation that they do in the central government allows them to even keep states at a constant, even though we all know that prices are going up and people's distress is going up.
And in terms of the implementation, is there any state in particular that has done a decent job in providing the 100 days of work or close to 100 days of work, and giving the wages on time, or be it maintaining complete transparency when it comes to what kind of works are being authorized? And
right. So I think one thing one will have to say that NREGA has been best at, and it's across the board, is that all its records are in public domain and are transparent, and down to the minutest detail. So every single muster roll, so for instance, the right to information battle began with people saying we want access to muster rolls. Every single muster roll is on the website. In many states, those summaries of muster rolls are painted on the walls. It's all on a central, what they call a MIS, a Management Information System. But it is also partly a JIS, a Janata Information System, because it's open to everyone, unlike in many other departments and ministries. And it is in real time. So wages are only paid through that MIS. Payment for material is only done through the MIS, and it's immediately in public domain. And it is transaction-based. So the transparency is something that is woven into the program. What is unfortunate is also woven into the program was the first time the statutory requirement for social audit was in the NREGA. And that has faced very stiff resistance from some states, including the state of Rajasthan, where we work and where social audit was born. Because as the vested interests realized how much it could actually make people auditors, and their whole attempt to undermine and steal from the program and manipulate the program would be undermined, they resisted it. So in the Supreme Court case, the Supreme Court has also been pushing on social audits, and it's actually required now social audits, independent social audit units to be set up everywhere. And the CAG office, the Comptroller and Auditor General, has for the first time in the world evolved social auditing standards, saying social audit is not just something by which people audit, but this is the methodology that has to be followed. These are the principles that must be maintained. And if you do that, you will have very robust social audits. So there's some very pioneering work happening on that side, but it still has not been properly implemented. So there are some states. So social audits, for instance, the states of Andhra, Telangana, have consistently done a lot. They found over 100 crores of fraud in social audits. They've recovered 20, 30 crores. There are thousands of people who've been removed from their jobs. There are hundreds of FIRs that have been filed. And that could easily become a model for all development programs to make it work much better. Just now there's been a paper on the Andhra Telangana thing which shows that lakhs of grievances have been sorted out through social audits. But very few states took it up as they should have, but some have. So the Sikkim consistently did very good work. Jharkhand recently has done some very interesting work. Tamil Nadu has done some interesting work on social audits. And just now, about 5 months ago, the state of Meghalaya passed a comprehensive social audit law, first time in the world, to cover all departments and all programs. I mean, initially I think there are some 22 programs it's covering, but this is where India is actually showing the way in the world on how these things can be done. But I think, again, a lot of citizen backing and support is needed for these things because it will empower citizens. Today, social audit in NREGA, but tomorrow it will be for everything that our roads in front of us, our water supply, our electricity. If we can start auditing and become active citizens, so it has implications right across the world.
I'm sure. I mean, I'm actually looking at the website as we speak, and it's quite impressive, the detail to which it maintains everything, and the fact that it is all real time is really commendable.
Yeah, it's an incredible website. Yeah. It could be much better organized, and that's something we've been trying to say to the ministry as well, so that people can very quickly find everything. Right. But it's all there, and it's all in public domain.
Right. I mean, I see that technology has been really at least attempted in the case of capturing all this data and maintaining transparency to the detail. Speaking of which, there is other technology intervention which has been happening, which is not so great when it comes to the results that it has been producing. That is the UID. Yeah. What is your take of the linking of UID with the bank accounts and the way it's sort of intervening in everyday life in the context of what we are talking right now?
Yeah. So UID came in, if we will all remember, saying that they want this UID to make sure that welfare benefits reach people and the right people. And there were three big claims made, and that's what I'd like to go back to. That firstly, they said we will make sure nobody is excluded, number one. Number two, they said that it will allow us efficiency in reaching the benefit quickly to the right person. And number three, they said, because it will identify the right person. Number three, they said it will cut out corruption. These are the three broad claims which were made, and that's why they said we are going to make it mandatory. And of course they ignored Supreme Court orders saying you cannot make this mandatory, and they carried on doing it, and it has had disastrous effects. So let me just give you the example of the PDS rations on the welfare side, because that was where in Rajasthan it was made completely mandatory. Today you cannot get your rations unless you put your thumb impression. So we need to understand that UID is not just a number. The only viable thing about it is it's biometric. That's how you identify. Everything else on that card can be completely wrong, because some small private operator, without cross-checking anything, wrote whatever age I may have said, or my address, I could have given any old address, so I can even change it today. Nobody is there to cross-check. But the one thing that is checked and cross-checked and stored away is the biometric. So obviously UID only functions when the biometric is used. Now when the biometric is used, massive numbers of people are excluded. Consistently in the state of Rajasthan with rations, with those who have Aadhaar and are Aadhaar seeded and have been chosen as Food Security Act beneficiaries, 30% of them were consistently left out. That's about 1 crore of the poorest people not being able to get food. Why? Because either your machine doesn't work, or it doesn't have internet connectivity, or your biometric doesn't work, or the various issues connected with that completely terrible technology. And in terms of RTI, actually a very interesting thing that Mr. Gopal Gandhi said. He said that RTI is people being able to watch every move of government. And the UID is the government being able to watch every move of every citizen.
Very nicely put.
It is actually Big Brother watching. It is actually a way of excluding. So what did it do? It excluded 30%, 20 to 30% of food security beneficiaries out, excluded by this. Corruption, even those who place their thumb impression, and therefore as soon as they place the thumb impression and the machine accepts it, the dealer tells you, oh, aapka angutha kaam nahi kiya, your thumb impression did not work. And they pocket the rations. And there's no way for that person to know that actually it did work and the rations are pocketed. So corruption has taken place, and we know in Rajasthan it is taking place because we asked the administration, all these dealers run shops that are not viable. So we say that how is it that if this has stopped corruption, how are they should have resigned their posts by now. Because you yourselves admit that without corruption they cannot run. So they all admit, yes, they're still being able to pilfer enough that it's worth their while to still run their shops. So there are a million ways in which we've documented how corruption continues. And now it's very difficult to make a complaint because they say, no, but your thumb impression was there. So you must have taken it. That's proof of your taking it. And the third thing about efficiency, I mean, it's incredible. People have to spend hours, make multiple trips because it all has to be internet connected, remote locations, machines go bad in the heat and the dust. And there's no way you just sit. You find people sitting outside the shops, coming back over and over again. There are places where there is no internet connectivity, so the biometric POS machine has to be taken to the top of a hill to get internet connectivity. So everyone has to march up the hill, put their biometric, then march down, come to the shop, pick up the rations and go. Can you imagine that? So the kinds of inefficiency. So I think you're going to have a discussion with Usha Ramanathan. So I won't get into all the issues related to surveillance because it's not just it's not a question of privacy, it's actually surveillance. So it's very interesting you made this, you looked at the NREGA website and then you came to UID because that's what we want. We want transparency where everyone can access it and it shows what government is doing. Here, what is actually being done, it's that opposite side where the government is gathering all the information, keeping it with itself and now saying, oh, there's such a big privacy risk, we won't even show So today the UID numbers are being masked, the bank account numbers are being masked, private sector interests are gaining access to it, those who hack the system are getting access to it. But even people who are not being paid in NREGA, their wages, for instance, cannot trace which bank account their wages have gone into. And there are situations where against their name, someone else's Aadhaar number has been seeded. So their wages are going into someone else's account and they can't find it. So there is a whole lot of very, very difficult implications for people on the side of welfare. And how in the Supreme Court the government can continue to say that, oh, but we are actually saving people's lives and we are delivering to the poor. It's complete lies, and those of us who live on the ground know it's lies. And unfortunately, very few people, again, who understand what it is in rural India to be dealing with these point-of-service machines. Those who are getting pensions because banks cannot cope with them, so this whole linking with the banking system. So banks don't listen to these old people who are coming for their 500 rupee pension. And so what has started our banking correspondence again with POS machines, biometric machines. Now an elderly person places their thumb impression on the machine and the POS fellow says, oh, it didn't work. He says, wash your hands, come back, places again. Each time you're placing your thumb impression, that's like signing a blank check. And that person can access your bank account and take away money, and you don't know what's happened. And you'll find out years later, or maybe never, or maybe by the time you find out this person has run away. And then again the state and the bank say, oh, we are not viable, you did place your thumb impression. So it's a nightmare what this UID is doing. And on the other hand, for middle-class people, I think people should watch out and understand every single move will be tracked. Where you travel, where you stay, what your bank accounts are. So today in the US, there's this big thing around Cambridge Analytica and what Facebook can take. And, of course, Mark Zuckerberg has been saying in Congress, but you can always switch off. In UID, you can't switch off. Even that is not there. If you want your passport, if you want a ticket, now they want to do it for air travel, for train travel. If you want to, wherever you use your card because your bank accounts are linked, every single bit of information, the profiling of you will be with government. And that can be and has been and will be hacked by private interests, commercial interests. And someday a very evil government can use it in very, very evil ways. And that's never something we want to allow to happen. It's completely autocratic, undemocratic, and it's both sides of the very dangerous use. So we are right to information people. We fight for information. But we know how in today's world where they're talking about data mining and data is gold and data is oil, what exactly they are wanting to do with our information in our lives.
Right. It's a slight trajectory here. You mentioned RTI. I want to just take a brief moment to reflect on what is the current situation in terms of the RTI itself, because I believe the CIC's post has been vacant for quite some time now, and there have been several media reports saying that the number of RTI applications that have been pending have really increased, and is this something as a trend that we are seeing only with the current government, or it started with the UPA II as well and just leading into the current situation?
No, as far as appointment of commissioners is concerned, it's much more a current government problem. It is true that after passing the RTI law, even UPA I tried to amend it. It is true that there is massive resistance in the whole system. It is true the whole political class has refused to accept the decision of the Information Commission that they must appoint public information officers and make all their records transparent. And that's across parties. But this government came in saying, it came in actually as a beneficiary of the RTI, because a lot of those scams that were exposed because of RTI.
Right.
And even the BJP, I know, has an RTI cell, as do most parties. But they have really undermined it. They have not tried to amend the law, but they tried to amend the rules. And now that they have not been able to do. And now they know that they can undermine it. So for 8 months, the Information Commission had no chief information commissioner. Today, there are 4 vacancies in the Central Information Commission. And there will be another 3 which will come up in the next few months. And the whole process of appointing someone takes time. So it's not like, so if there is going to be a vacancy in November, from now you have to start work, and there is no attempt to do that because it takes time, and meetings have to be held, vetting has to be done, applications have to be sifted through. So it's clear that Without the Information Commission, this act can barely run. They are trying to undermine it. And then the only time they have appointed commissions is when the court has pushed them to do that.
Mm.
And I think what we need to understand in RTI is not just the survival of RTI, but the progression of RTI. We passed the law in 2000, and it came into effect on 12th October 2005. Now, we want the law to move forward. We want a more and more transparent society. We want to change from a culture of secrecy to a culture of openness. And what we find is that they are not only going back and they're getting regressive, but those parts which we hoped would come into effect, Section 4, proactive disclosure, what the NREGA cite is that you're not putting in RTI applications.
Right.
You're getting access to that information. So that's what it should be. If it can be for NREGA, it can be for every single ministry. Every single bit of expenditure comes on the website immediately. Why should it not? Why should it not for telecom? Why should it not for coal? Why should it not for mining? Why should it not for oil and natural gas, or every education, health, every single ministry? Why not? So that is something that they are not doing at all. And that's something in their hands. So if someone says they are a transparent government, that's the first evaluation to see. What are they really doing? Which they can, and they are mandated by law to do. And the second thing, again, is this undermining of the commissions. And the third is, which again, people look strictly at the RTI, but we need to look at a comprehensive set of things. There needs to be a kind of a phase 2 of RTI, which means, okay, those who've got information now act on it. So you need accountability. Right. So you need a strong whistleblower law, because we've had more than 70 people who have been killed in trying to demand RTI information. So we need them to be protected and others in the system to be protected. And we need a Lokpal legislation, and we need a grievance redress legislation. Grievance redress for everyone's everyday issues, and Lokpal for the grand corruption. Lokpal law has been passed for 4 years. This government has not put it into effect. For 4 years, by refusing to appoint a Lokpal. On grievance redress law, they said the day we come in, they blocked it in the last parliament, and it had passed the Lok Sabha, but did not let it pass the Rajya Sabha. And they said the day we come in, we will bring it in, and they've just put it, and they now want to make it a scheme. On whistleblower protection, people continue to be killed, and they just don't care. They want to actually change the whistleblower law, amend whistleblower so that it becomes totally ineffective. So we need to understand this government has actually shown itself to be the worst. Because existing things it's backtracking on.
Right. Yeah, and the reason I brought up RTI is because I see a strong connection with the other social security acts, and NREGA, or the right to education, or right to, everything is so strongly interconnected, and you need one to complement the other.
Absolutely.
And undermining any one of them will just weaken the whole, this whole social structure that has been put in place.
Absolutely. So, Suresh, there's citizens have played an extraordinary role in the last 10, 15 years. If you see some of the best legislation that's happened in post-independence India, it's because of the role of citizens. And they are paying with their lives, and yet they are fighting. And yet this government that's getting salaries, and this political class that's ruling in our name in a democratic framework, is actually been the biggest block. They are the ones who should be moving forward. They are the ones who should be happy that there are citizens groups doing things.
Right.
So, and they are the ones who, let's say, the day that they come in, they can make sure their own cadres also don't get controlled. Because RTI, for instance, if you have transparency, automatically people get controlled. It's not just post facto corruption; it prevents corruption. But that's what people need to understand, that there is no other way except citizens' battles and people's movements and social movements have to be strengthened. And yes, finally the political class has to deliver. They have to pass laws in parliament, and nobody is undermining them. But we want to push them to do their role, and we want to expose them when they're not playing their role.
Right. I mean, those are very good, I would say, concluding remarks. But I'll still give you a chance to conclude. Given the starting from when you in 1980s when you started working till now, you've seen various legislations come into the foray. You've seen how each one of these acts evolved, and how also you early on in the interview you very rightly said how NREGA is empowering all those people who otherwise will not have a fair chance to earn a decent livelihood. What do you see as the next set of laws that you think will be required, or at least making the existing laws more effective? What is the way forward in that context?
Yeah, so there are two things I'd like to say. Actually, I want to briefly mention, there's a new book out which Aruna Roy and the MKSS Collective has sort of put together to acknowledge the role of the small, ordinary person in these battles. It's the days and months and weeks they gave during campaigns, during dharnas, during andolans. So it's a book called the RTI Story, Part of the People. And it's also going to be available, so sometime maybe we could have a discussion around that, but it's available also on in India on Amazon and things, but even abroad there is a particular distributor. Now that has been to actually acknowledge the role of the ordinary citizen, often the person who has never been to school, a Dalit, a woman who's marginalized, from marginalized communities. And they are the salt of India's democracy. They are the salt of the earth in that sense. And in the battles ahead, they are the ones who told us that we have to fight for records, we have to fight for information, we have to fight. They are the ones who conceived of. Now, the rights-based laws actually have shown what great potential they could have. Despite trenchant opposition, they have actually taken on this opposition. We need, instead of this very failed insurance system, which they are now trying to bring into health, we need proper public health with the right to health. We need good government schools with the right to education. We need legislation in various rights-based areas. We need social order to be strengthened, like the CAG and the Supreme Court are even helping us do and telling us where we can go. We very badly need a grievance redress or an accountability law, where if government servants do not perform their task of fulfilling the rights and carrying out their duties, they are penalized. Like in the RTI, if there was not a penalty clause, the RTI would have never worked. That clause says if a government servant does not deliver information in 30 days, they will be penalized from their pocket, from their salary. That kind of situation needs to exist if you're not giving rations, if you're not teaching in schools, if you're not running hospitals well, if you're not doing your road building, your water supply, all the essential services for which the state is there, or law and order, or maintaining peace and security. And the biggest peace and security is, are women safe, are minorities safe, are people who are at the marginalized parts of society, are they going to get life of dignity? So there is, India's democracy is fighting to be more participatory. Rights-based legislation gives people a share in governance. It needs to be expanded. It has been, to my mind, a successful kind of legislative intervention, and it needs to be expanded. But it needs support of people. So, and we can't give up, and we can't get tired, and we can't get cynical. We can't afford that.
Right. I think that's a very positive note to end on, that we cannot be cynical. At the same time, we have to be more active, and it's only the participatory democracy that is going to bring in the change that we all.
There's one thing I do want to say, Suresh, and it's very important, is that this current scenario where the political class is playing such an irresponsible role in dividing society, in not giving everyone a sense of inclusion, in not giving dignity. In the state of Rajasthan, people have been lynched. I mean, whether someone is innocent or not innocent, do we want a society where people are going to take justice into their hands and lynch people? And actually, these were completely innocent people. We are creating fear in our society. Our own children in the district where I work, Rajsamand, we all know the horrible murder of this person called Afrazul, who had nothing to do with anything. He was an ordinary laborer. The only thing, his name was Muslim. So, do we want to have that situation? And that was put on video and it was made viral. The killing by an 11-year-old nephew of the murderer. And so, if we have these situations coming in where we are dividing society for political gain, the fabric of our country will not survive. So I think we all again that's one other area. We can pass all the laws in the world, but if we do not make sure that we are a strong, inclusive society with respecting the plurality that exists in the country, we are really going to divide our country rather than strengthen it. And that's something that's extremely important, more important than narrow political gains that are being attempted.
Right. I think that should definitely worry all of us. Well, Nikhil, thank you very much for your time. It was a great learning, and got to know a lot of intricate details about these various acts. Appreciate your time that you spent with us.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
Thank you.